I wanted to talk to you today about Mama Axe's escape specifically. So I brought down my Titanic model that my husband gave me because I wanted to show you something. So I'm going to use Ezrella's cat toy, but because it's a laser pointer, and I'm going to show you. So let's go down to the ship. So here's the stern portion of the ship. And, you know, as I said previously, this is where really all the action happened for Mama Aks. So I think she came up these and out of these doors into the aft well deck at about maybe 12:50 or just before that, with a friend of hers who had knocked on her door and said, "Did you know the ship hit something?" And she said, "No, I didn't know." And one of the things I was pointing out is that why I think her cabin might have been on the port side. And I think my thinking is that she didn't hear anything. And so she was way back here, you know, and I'm thinking she was probably on E deck. And of course the collision happened way up on the starboard side.
And didn't just not hear it, didn't feel it either.
Didn't hear it, didn't feel it. And so she said, well, let's just go up and check it out. So she went with this woman who was probably a young mother immigrating. And they went up, came out and talked to a crewman in the aft well deck and said, "Is the ship in any danger?" And he said, "No, go back to sleep." So they were just two women hanging out in this well deck, young women, and it was, you know, a really interesting night. It was 27 degrees, there was no moon, and the stars were supposed to be absolutely spectacular. So they stood out there, and at a certain point, the steam started to be released through the steam whistles. And of course, it was making a huge racket. And at that point, or right after that, rockets started going off over their heads. And at that point, they walked over to the starboard side. And how do I know it was just the starboard side? Was because that's where the first lifeboats were launched. I believe lifeboat 7 was the first to be launched.
The first one with Nellie Snyder and the honeymooning couples. Supposedly, they said all brides and grooms can board, and that was supposed to be a way to encourage people who were otherwise hesitant to feel that they had a kind of weird sense of belonging by gathering as a community of recent newlyweds in lifeboats.
Wow, that's kind of an interesting factoid. And then what happened was she walked over to the starboard side and looked over, and she saw something that really, you know, made her blood run cold. And that was, she saw, as she said, little boats in the water. She saw lifeboats in the water. And of course, at that point, the two of them just went back down, climbed the stairs down, and started to dress and get their children. And she says a life belt on bait, but it didn't fit. So they came back up, and this time the companionways were filled, crowded. You know, people were pushing, shoving, trying to get up the stairs because, of course, you know, with the racket going off of the steam being released, almost everybody woke up and were trying to stream up into the aft well deck. And this time they finally get up, and this whole well deck is crowded with people. And I think what happened is these stairs, of course, on either side, there's a low gate right here, and that's between C deck and B deck. And they were locked, and initially there were crewmen who were keeping people out, but these became completely crowded with people pushing up, and they're very narrow, right? And so there was totally impassable. Now, this deck is about 9 feet here, okay? And so there's no way for her to get up. So at a certain point, young men look down from the boat deck, so-called because that's where the lifeboats were kept, and they saw that the women in this aft well deck with children couldn't do anything. They couldn't get up to the lifeboats to have a chance. So they jumped down, and she describes it almost like a circus act. So they jumped down the back of these deck houses here, maybe, stopping, maybe jumping on this crane arm, on the housing, and then on this hatch cover right here, and then, into the well deck. And they made this plan where they took these women up using a human ladder. And I've tried to explain that before, but you can see how unbelievably harrowing that would be to go up, to have these people, random young men, helping you get up this very high span. And then once you were here on B deck, of course, you had to go to A deck. And then once you were on A deck, you had to go up to the boat deck. Of course, at some point, it's known that some boats were loaded from A deck. So lifeboats were lowered down and people went through the windows. But
do we know at what point the perceptibility of the list
that's
came for the people who were crowding?
That is a very good point, because how terrifying
to have to climb, and then also
yes,
potentially to feel, the.
I know, right? It's 10 to 2. You're on the sinking ocean liner. It's 27 degrees outside. There's no moon, and the ship is pitched downward because it's down by the head, so it's pitched down at an angle. And then it's also, as you pointed out, listing to the port side. And that had to have made it even more harrowing to try to navigate making your way. I think it was probably a young man would say, step on my knee, or maybe he was on this hatch cover, which was a couple feet high. And then step on my shoulder, step on my head, pass to the next guy, put your foot on the deck, and then you'd have to go over the railing, and then you'd have to keep doing this maneuver. And it had to have been terrible. And one of the things I have to tell you that I think about, and I mention often, is at what point did she say to herself, okay, they're offering to help us and take us up, but there are a lot of other people who are too afraid, and they sat down on the deck and they did nothing, and they just accepted their fate. And oftentimes when I'm in trouble, or something hasn't gone well for me, and I'm really, really nervous, I think of her at 10 to 2, and making that decision to try for it, to fight for her life, and how strong she had to be to just make that decision, to take his hand.
Yeah, but you also think about, were as many of them accepting their fate as they were possibly thinking, should we just wait for orders? We have been raised to trust authority, or to expect people from upper classes, people in positions of authority, to give us directions. And as long as we wait for them to do it, we will be fine.
This is so amazing. Absolutely.
It's supposed to not sink. This can't be happening.
Right.
And so they will come to tell us what to do, not knowing that those people were also, dealing with their own internal turmoil.
This is a really good point. I guess I never really thought about that.
Terrified themselves too.
Sure. Yeah. And that's interesting, this whole idea of the level or the degree individually of your not wanting to wait for somebody to tell you to do something. And what leads to that is that because you're scrappy and you're used to having to fight for things, what led her, what kind of life and background did she have to have, or she didn't feel compelled to have somebody tell her it was okay to try to save yourself.
And maybe she knew what was possible. Maybe she was, there were the supposed majority of passengers who believed the ship was unsinkable. And then there were people, I don't think Esther Hart was the only one, who came aboard the ship thinking that there was a possibility of disaster, maybe not of that magnitude, but knowing that something could happen that made the ship unsafe from the very beginning. Even I mentioned earlier Nellie Pillsbury Snyder and her husband John on their honeymoon. They had been honeymooning in Europe, and as they were getting the tickets for the Titanic, which they didn't know very much about in advance, they wanted to know who the captain of the ship was. And the person selling the tickets, I think that was who it was, said, "Oh, well, you'll find out at dinner. You'll turn over your plate and that will tell you who the captain is." And they said to each other, "Well, as long as it's not Captain Smith, we don't want it to be him because, we think he always messes things up and we just don't trust Captain Smith." Whereas so many others in the ship supposedly held Captain Smith in very high esteem, but either they had an experience of him or heard of others having an experience of him that made him not very reliable. And so according to a recollection of Nellie, nearly 70 years after the disaster, is one of the last surviving first-class adult passengers. They turned over their plate and nearly died, nearly fell apart when they saw that it was Captain Smith who was the captain. And so no wonder, if that story is true, if she remembers correctly and isn't embellishing, and no wonder that when lifeboat number 7 took off first, she and her husband were in it.
That's a very good point.
Gotta get off. This is the...
Wow.
We didn't prophesy it, but we knew that something like this was possible.
Wow.
Something that would, we don't know that 1,500 people estimated are going to die tonight. But we know that we're not going to be 2 people who got last behavior and, why did this large number of third-class passengers or passengers who were in third class die versus in first class. There is a tendency to forget the role of language.
That's true.
And what occurred, and not even not understanding English, but possibly misconstruing what was being said in other languages, or for behaviors. If people appear to be calm, even though they are saying, for the time being, we will, board only women and children, to not know what they're saying, but to see or to hear what appears to be calm, that had to be a deterrent, or something that gave them a false sense of calm.
What else are you familiar with any other stories or accounts specifically of other people getting out of third class? Because
definitely the one that always comes to my mind, in part because he is one of the many passengers who allegedly had the Titanic curse, but also, of course, was coming of age as World War I was coming about, and, other threats were materializing. Daniel Buckley.
Oh, yeah.
Who,
right.
As you know, I don't know if it was when he first got out of bed or, if he into the corridor and, his feet were submerged in water very quickly. And he told, the other people in his room, as you know, Titanic, one of the main benefits of being on the ship in third class versus in third class in other ships was you kind of had a suite. You had a room that you could share with other people, and you could develop a sense of small community in that room versus being like in a dorm with tons of beds all alongside each other, as though you were in the barracks or in a prison. You had your own kind of private space, potentially with 3 or more other strangers. But he said, the water is up to here, and something has happened. And the roommate said, get back in bed. You're not in Ireland now. The ship can't sink. But he knew, because he had been out of bed and had experienced the water, that it was time to go. And of course he did survive, only to be killed 6 years later in
Right.
World War I.
Yeah. Wow. That's a very interesting recollection, because, there are so many stories. Story of a third-class surviving male.
Right. Yeah.
That is unusual.
Yeah.
And
I'm sure a lot of people thought, he was one of the few who dressed in women's clothing or hid in the bottom of the boat to
right.
get away. I'm not sure of how the story panned out, but we who know a lot of passenger stories know that there were a number of ways that people could have, again, now that unfortunately are not portrayed in film. One thinks about in order to relay the myth that the lifeboats just didn't return, that they left everybody to fear for themselves or fear of being swamped. It is often left out of Titanic films and retellings outside of really thick books that lifeboat number 4, with some of the very wealthy women did, or some of the women who were of wealth did return, or came close enough for swimmers to get into the boat and for them to pull swimmers into the boat. And so there is this image that's been running in my mind recently of these, women who would be in Newport in the mansions hosting, these opulent parties, having dead men, alongside them, frozen to death, injured in a boat, and then also, finding ways to nurse and tend to the grief of the other passengers in the boat, and then to have their children, their rich, spoiled children who, may have never had other typical troubles in their life, to be confronted with death and horror and suffering, and to be suffering themselves through the cold in that boat alongside them. And I think you mentioned that your great-grandmother may have been in that boat with them, or at
Yes,
some point she
exactly.
was Ella
So-
Elkins Leitner and Marion Thayer and Madeline Astor.
And this
Captain
is
Roshan's room.
really an interesting point, and I'm really glad you brought it up, because in most books, hundreds of books, it's said that my great-grandmother was in lifeboat 13, which of course is over here on the starboard side, and that my great-uncle was in 11. A lot of research has been done now, and because of her accounts and her talking about being in a lifeboat, and we think that, initially what's interesting is that lifeboat number 4 was one of the lifeboats that was loaded from A deck. And so we think what happened is that she was lifted from the C deck to B deck, and then to A deck, and that's when the baker Jockin was helping, and of course this was late, and so it was, you talk about the list, it was really listing to the port, and so the port boats were swung away from the ship, and the women didn't want to get in, so he was literally throwing people in. Well, it's now thought that maybe she got up, put her foot on the A deck as these men were helping her, and to help her, someone took the baby out of her arms so she could get across the rail, and then took the baby up some stairs that went in here and, came up to the boat deck. And that he might have either been thrown into 10 or gotten into 11. And she didn't see what happened. And so she was completely traumatized by losing track of the baby. Mm-hmm. And so if she was only on A deck, it makes sense that she said she went everywhere, frantically searching for him, that she got up to A deck and started running, looking for him everywhere, as she said. And she got up to one of the last boats left, which was lifeboat 4, which loaded from A deck. So it is possible, and Bill Wormstad thinks that they might have, well, of course they were in different lifeboats, but thinks it's possible that she wasn't in 13 and he may not.